Hello, welcome to the Saroy channel, wherever you are in the world. I do hope you're exceedingly well, and loads of love to each and every one of you. And I hope that you're going to get that lovely hot cup of cocoa or coffee or tea, whatever it is that you drink. But you don't even need caffeine for my stories, because I've got a fabulous story for you tonight. But before we get started, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, click the notification bell and the thumbs up. And let's get started with tonight's story. Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners, my name is Lorelei, and I'm from the bluegrass state of Kentucky, which is the southeastern North American state along the west side of the Appalachian Mountains, bounded by the Ohio River, with Frankfort as our state capital and Louisville, our largest city. Kentucky borders Virginia in the southeast and Tennessee to the south. I grew up on a horse farm in Kentucky along the old Frankfort Pike, which is considered one of America's most scenic drives and is a stretch of the HWY 1681, which runs from Lexington to Frankfort, where you'll see extravagant mansions, rock fences, and very old statuesque trees. I grew up in the 1980s and was raised on an exquisite-looking horse farm on about 340 acres of verdant grassland, sectioned off by pretty wooden poled fencing. It was here where my father raised foals and produced racehorses, as well as providing boarding facilities for horses. So you could say that my parents were both mad about horses, but you'd have to be if you run a horse farm, as having a fervent passion for horses is a prerequisite for the job, and my parents were very partial towards thoroughbreds. Some of the horses that we raised were prime specimens and remarkable-looking animals, even if I say so myself. Our farm boasted a natural creek, a couple of ponds, a small wooded grove, paddocks, tack and feed rooms, foaling rooms, a round pen and lunging ring, and the list goes on and on. I grew up in a very grandiose, rather lavish-looking federal-style farmhouse with my older sister Natalie and very strict, punctilious parents. I gather our house was actually built in the colonial times and was a very large white two-storey home with a side-gabled roof, large dramatic double-hung, symmetrically placed windows with 5 windows on the second storey, light blue shutters and an elliptical fan light above our blue front door, as well as a decorative front entry porch with elegant curvings. I do remember growing up that my controlling father was very stiff upper lip, regimental, authoritarian and exceedingly disciplined. So much so that our home became like a military barracks rather than a fun-loving, wholesome environment to raise kids. My pedantic father was meticulous in everything he did and expected us to apply the same scrupulous, efficient standards to our own young lives. He was a stickler for timekeeping, so as children we were expected to come downstairs for dinner looking impeccable, without a hair out of place at 7 p.m. sharp. If we were a minute late, there would be hell to pay, and we would ultimately be in big trouble and would be seriously reprimanded. We soon learnt to adjust, however. It would seem that even though my father was an iron-fisted disciplinarian, I'm glad to say that he certainly chose not to dictate our marital choices, which was his one saving grace, if indeed he had any at all. Nevertheless, he would draw a deep line in the sand and dig his heels in if he discerned in any way that our potential suitor did not have deep pockets, so to speak. Later that year, disaster was to strike our entire family when my father was riding. We knew something was wrong when a sheepish-looking Zoe returned to the paddocks without my father on her back. Luckily, my father died on impact by the massive injuries he sustained from the fall, and so I'm heartily relieved and very grateful that he didn't suffer. The irony is that my father used to tell us that one day he would die after being thrown off a horse very violently. I mean, how did he even know this? My mother would reprimand him, telling him to stop being so ridiculous, and he would say, "I've seen the fall in my dreams for many years now. It is going to happen one day, and you need to be prepared for it. You will be required to know how you will manage things once I'm gone." It seemed that his foreboding premonition had most certainly come true, but help was at hand in the form of my older cousin Robert, who was 28 at the time and had been trained by my father to follow diligently in his footsteps. So it was a seamless transition as Robert moved into our family home, taking up residence with us and resuming the reins as man of the house, as well as managing our horse farm. This was such a relief for the all of us, as everything at home returned to normal. I can honestly say that I wasn't totally devastated about my father's untimely, unforeseen death, which I know sounds absolutely appalling for a daughter to concede, and I am desperately ashamed of feeling this way. I believe that my father's arbitrary, draconian child-raising methods and his stringent oppressive rules meant that his death was almost a relief for the all of us, and even my mother blossomed and brightened into a brand new woman after he'd gone. I began to realise that even as his seemingly devoted wife, she had been as terrified by our dictatorial father as much as her own kids had been. I was to learn that people in the community at the time did respect and admire my father's work ethics and incredible professionalism. Yet despite all this, he was not well liked among many of the locals. Many people described him as a cantankerous, self-righteous, opinionated person that insisted on doing everything rigidly and strictly by the book. I believe all my life I'd been so terrified of my father, and he was so emotionally disconnected to us as children, that there was no love lost between us, which in hindsight is desperately sad. Needless to say, I wore the battle wounds of years of being raised by him, and these extensive emotional scars were deeply entrenched in my psyche. If I was running late for anything, I would begin to hyperventilate and panic, and I would feel like a deer caught up in headlights. I could become so overwhelmed and overwrought that I've even been known to faint and pass out. Once my father had died, I felt like a bird that had been released from her gold-gilded cage, and it was like my clipped wings had suddenly grown back. My parochial father was very old school and quite chauvinistic. He believed that a woman's virtuous place was in the home, and never, ever in the workplace. I remember asking my mother how she'd feel about me applying for a job as a receptionist in the nearby town. I was bewildered and delighted when she proclaimed that she was not adverse to the idea at all. In fact, she actively encouraged it. "I think it'll do you good," she told me, "to get some work experience behind you. I know your father would have heartily disapproved, but he's not here now to interfere, so you can do what you like." I showed her the ad in the local paper, which read, "Glamorous receptionist required for doctor's surgery 3 times a week, to answer phone calls and to deal with clients. Must be well presented, with excellent phone manner." "That's right up your alley," my mother told me. "Give them a call at once." And so it was arranged that my interview for the job would be on a Monday morning. Over that weekend it poured and poured with a soaking rain, and by the Monday morning things had cleared up considerably, and I was heartily relieved. I thought it was a very good omen for my interview that the sun was now sparkling through the blue firmament, and it was an exquisitely beautiful day. And so it was that I remember waking up in a frantic state with my heart pounding through my chest at 100 miles an hour, as the same tape recording kept playing over and over again in my head like a dull, throbbing, drumming headache that just wouldn't let up. "You must not be late! You must not be late! You must not be late!" This was ultimately what I went through night after night before dinner time in our home, when my dad was alive. I was so petrified of being late and being seriously reprimanded by a disapproving father who always looked like an angry Rottweiler whenever we let him down. I assure you that if looks could bite, he would have shredded me to pieces, as such was the level of his incandescent rage. Lucky he didn't lay a finger on any of us, but that didn't make the emotional trauma any less brutal or significant. I hurriedly got dressed in a smart outfit with a belt and shoes and dashed out towards my red Ford Mustang like a bat out of hell, climbing into the car seat and starting up the engine vigorously. "Calm down, dear," my mother assured me. "You have plenty of time before your job interview. There's no need to rush. You really do look phenomenal in that smart dress of yours. Anyone would be crazy to turn you away. Good luck with the interview, dear. Not that you're going to need it, of course," she said, kissing me gently on both of my cheeks. My mother watched me as I drove down our long driveway, past the fields of grazing horses, where I turned to the right down a few obscure dirt roads, in order to take a shortcut, but that was the worst decision I could have ever made in the circumstances, as the recent rain had turned the roads into a slippery, muddy bath, well suited for a pot-belly pig, but most certainly not for my car. My poor Mustang was fighting to steady herself and was precariously sliding all over the place and had completely lost traction. I pressed my foot down hard on the accelerator, but it made matters infinitely worse. All of a sudden my car ground to a standstill, and before long I was completely trapped in the mud. I began to panic and hyperventilate as sweat started pouring down my face profusely, almost as if it was raining heavily, as even my hair became soaked. I staggered out of the car and tried my level best to pull the Ford Mustang out of the mud, but it was to no avail, as I really didn't have the human strength to do it. And I needed someone really strong, probably a machine or something to help me in this situation. But it didn't stop me from trying nevertheless. Little did I realise that my cake was now soaked with mud, but so were my formal leather shoes. I began to scream and scream at the top of my lungs. "No! No! Please, God, no! Why does this have to happen now? It's not fair! Oh, no! No!" I began to scream and scream at the top of my lungs. Oh, I was just so pent up with emotion, and my high-pitched voice must have travelled for miles around. I was so enraged that I lashed out at my car, blaming it for what had happened to me. I was kicking and slapping it like an angry, petulant kid. And then the heavens opened from my tear ducts, and I began to sob and sob. Oh, no, no! I felt so completely helpless, powerless and debilitated. The idea of being late was so overwhelming for me. I could hear my father's words echoing in my head like a resounding bell. "Never ever be late, as it is the epitome of discourteousness and impudence." In those days we did not have mobile phones, so I couldn't call for any kind of help. I knew that if I trekked laboriously back to my own house, I would be running very late and would almost certainly miss the interview. I could not even get my car tyres out of this mud, so either way I was stuck. I was running out of any choices. Once again I let out a scream of frustration as the gripping terror of running late just completely overwhelmed me. All of a sudden I heard what I can only describe as a thundering booming sound that caused the ground to vibrate like a steam train on full throttle coming towards me. I think I was way too bemused and overawed to even react. It was then that I saw them, and words fail me to describe what I saw. For never in all my born days did I know that critters like this could actually exist in our reality. One appeared to be male, the other female, as she had a pair of small hair-covered breasts, but I could not discern what on earth they were, for they seemed to be like ape men. I think the sheer size of these creatures is what beheld my awe the most, for they were gargantuan in width, height and weight, and were larger than grizzly bears, and I promise you that's true. I would ascertain that even a grizzly would be intimidated by these extraordinary beasts. These 8-foot ape men were very human-like, but they were completely covered with long flowing hazelnut hair with auburn and blonde highlights, with the exception of their faces, which were a dark nut brown colour and were completely hairless. I noted that much like other primates, they also had overlong arms, which led me to conclude that although they were bipedal, they could easily run on 4 legs as well as 2. I also noticed that they were ripped with dense muscle and were very sinewy, and they possessed very powerful shoulders and a cone-shaped head that simply sat on the shoulders with no apparent neck. The female's face was a lot more feminine than the male's and was long, while the male's face was very broad, but they both had golden brown, deep-set eyes, flat noses, furrowed brow ridges and thin lips. For a moment I stared at the critters with eyes as round as saucers and my chin hanging to the ground in shock. The first thought that entered my mind was that I had to be dreaming, and this was not real. There was no way that this was real. Yet I knew in my heart of hearts that this was indeed no dream, nor was it a hallucination of any kind. This was real. I think shock metamorphosized into terror. I began to shake and wobble like an involuntary blancmange jelly, as I was certain that this powerful critter, or these critters so to speak, were seeing me as an easy meal, and in seconds I would be devoured as their prey. My mind was telling me to run away, but I just couldn't do it. I couldn't move a muscle. I couldn't understand why I seemed so incapacitated, and I could feel the beads of perspiration pouring down my face as I had broken into a cold sweat. I watched in absolute horror as the critters glided past me towards my Mustang, and to my absolute amazement, they lifted it out of the muddy ditch, as if it was a toy car. I've never seen such strength exhibited before. For what they did, a man could never have done. It was light work for them moving my car out of that muddy ditch. For a moment I was so jubilantly happy that I forgot my fear, and I began to laugh out loud. That was how thrilled I was. If I was quick, I could make it to my interview in time. The female critter turned around to look at me directly in the eyes, and we connected. She held my gaze for a moment, and I could tell that she was very kind and sympathetic towards my plight, and that she'd intended to help me all along, and that harm never even entered the equation. I believe she had responded to my screams. She pointed to my car, and I climbed into the seat and drove away, honking my horn to say thanks to the two hairy critters. I could see them standing there, watching me like two giants as I drove away. In those frantic moments, the only thoughts that I could get into my head were about the interview and getting there on time. Now the anxiety came flooding black like a tsunami, and all I could think about was not being late at any cost. I quickly parked my car in the parking bay and hurried through the glass doors towards the reception counter to announce my arrival. I remember wringing my hands in delight. I was thrilled. I couldn't believe that I'd arrived at the interview on time, and my mind was far from thoughts about my dishevelled, muddy appearance. In fact, in truth, I'd completely forgotten about it. I was oblivious to the mascara stains down my cheeks and my muddy dress and shoes that were caked in mud. On the contrary, I'd not given them a second thought. All I felt at this moment was huge relief to have arrived on time, and in my inner world, that was all that really mattered. The trim, blonde, perfectly groomed receptionist gave me a disapproving once-over, looking down on me as if I was a lower form of pond life. She beckoned for me to follow her and led me towards the interview room, with a rarely pompous look on her face. I remember thinking to myself that I didn't like her at all, as she seemed a little hoity-toity and rather full of herself and her own sense of self-importance. Once the gentleman shook my hand, I noticed him staring down at my mud-soaked shoes with a look of absolute horror on his face, especially as the mud that I was trailing in was beginning to mark the white carpet. That was when I wanted the ground to swallow me up, because I was so embarrassed and too tongue-tied to explain my horrifying appearance, but luckily he said nothing. I suddenly felt very self-conscious because I knew I didn't stand a chance of getting the job looking like this. I had observed 3 very smartly attired women waiting in line for their interview, and I knew that this man would never pick someone who took regular mud baths before the surgery opened its doors every morning. "Thank you very much, Miss Markham. It has been a pleasure to meet you. We will be in touch in due course." Of course, I knew he never would be. When I returned home to tell my mother what had transpired, my mother got really mad at me. "Lorelei, what on earth induced you to go driving down those mud roads, especially after all the rain we've been having lately? You really are a silly girl. I'm amazed you got the car out of the ditch. How that happened, God only knows." I was not about to tell her about the ape-like humanoids I'd encountered, whom had helped me out of my dreadful plight. If I was challenged into believing what I'd seen was in fact real, how in the world would my mother ever believe my incredulous account? It was highly doubtful that she would, so I kept my lips sealed in regards to that matter. "You mean you went to the interview looking like that?" said my cousin Robert, cracking up with laughter. "You are kidding me. I can only imagine what they must have thought. Have you seen what you look like in that mirror?" "I know," I said. "It was a complete waste of time. I don't know why I even bothered." I began to start crying. "That's defeatist talk," said Robert. "I know what we need to do," he said decisively. "Go upstairs, get into the shower right now and change into something smart and meet me back at the car. Hurry, will you?" Before long I was back at the car, all neatly turned out, and Robert looked at me approvingly. "That's more like it," he said. "Now let's get going." And so it was. Robert parked his car outside the doctor's surgery and beckoned for me to follow him in, which I did so reluctantly. I was amazed to see a long line of women still waiting to be interviewed for the receptionist position. Robert added my name to the long line and the end of the list and sat with me in the waiting room. "But I've already been interviewed," I explained. "I can't go back in again." "Yes, you can," said Robert. "You get in there and tell them exactly why you came back and about your accident in the mud. You tell them why you want the job. I don't want any defeatist chatter from you. Do you understand?" I nodded. There was no point in arguing with him. "Pleased to meet you, Lorelei," said the interview, extending his hand. "Your name is very familiar. Have we met?" "Yes, earlier this morning when I was racing to get here and ended up stranded on a muddy road with my tyres caught in the mud. I was so desperate to get to the interview on time, I didn't realise what an atrocious and sorry sight I looked. I'm here to show you that I am actually glamorous and would normally look the part for the receptionist's job if it were not for the unforeseen circumstances that I encountered on my way here." "Feisty and very determined, with plenty of grit. I like it," said the interviewer. "Young lady, I think you've got the job. You're just what we're looking for." "But what about all the other people you have interviewed?" I asked, looking shocked. "Surely you can't just announce that I've got the job just like that." "I can do anything I like. You're just the right person that's come along. Congratulations. I'm very glad you came back, because the sight you looked this morning did have the office talking, but you have balls and courage, and I like that a lot." Looking back all these years later, I know that I saw two Sasquatch who both helped me to get an interview on time, even if I did look a little worse for wear. I truly believe they were alerted by my frantic screams and came to my rescue, all because I had an irrational terror of being late. So there you are. That's my story. Do you know, I really loved that story. Until next time, goodbye and good night.